It was one of those mornings where the mist clung thick to the farm, creeping over the fields like a slow-moving blanket, wrapping everything in a hushed, eerie silence. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint gray glow over the barn. Cal Van Harper wiped the sleep from his eyes, groggy from the late-night repairs on the fence, but something was wrong. Something had disrupted the usual calm of his small farm in rural Virginia. He stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, looking out at the barn. A faint, nervous whinny from Luna, the family's prize mare, cut through the quiet. Normally, Luna was a picture of serenity, spending her days grazing lazily in the pasture, her coat shining under the sunlight. But today, she was anything but calm. Calvin's heart skipped a beat as he watched Luna, normally so composed, begin to stomp in agitation. She pawed at the ground, her nostrils flaring, and she let out a deep, strangled whinny, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. Sweat beaded on her dark brown coat, glistening in the foggy morning light. "That's not right," Calvin muttered to himself, his voice tight with concern. He knew Luna well. This wasn't just a case of the usual morning restlessness. Something was happening to her, something beyond his understanding. He turned toward the farmhouse, his mind racing. His daughter, Mare, was already up, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway. He didn't want to scare her, but there was no time for hesitation. The horse was in distress. "Mare, get the phone. Call Dr. Everett," he shouted as he ran towards the barn, his boots crunching the gravel path. He could hear the urgency in his own voice as it cracked through the cool air. Mare rushed down the stairs, eyes wide with alarm. Calvin barely noticed her, already halfway to the barn. He threw open the barn door and strode inside, looking to where Luna paced back and forth, her movements jerky and desperate. "Easy, girl," Calvin murmured, his hand gently rubbing her neck, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Luna's familiar warmth and scent did little to soothe him now. Her trembling was too much. This was beyond what he had dealt with before. Mare arrived behind him, breathless, holding the phone up to Calvin. "I called Dr. Everett. He's on his way." Calvin nodded, but his attention was already elsewhere. Luna was no longer standing still. She staggered, nearly toppling over as her legs buckled beneath her, her body contorted in a way Calvin had never seen before. Something was terribly wrong. "Stay with her, Mare," Calvin said sharply, his voice hoarse with panic. "Don't let her fall." Mare knelt beside Luna, stroking her mane, but she was barely able to keep her footing as Luna thrashed. The mare's labored breathing filled the barn, growing louder by the second. Then, without warning, a sharp cry echoed through the barn, the unmistakable sound of a horse in labor. Calvin's stomach turned. He wasn't prepared for this. Luna had never shown signs of pregnancy, at least not that they had noticed. Her belly hadn't swollen in any obvious way. No, this couldn't be happening. But it was. Mare gasped in horror as Luna's body heaved again, the foal's head emerging. Calvin barely registered the sight, the way Luna's muscles bunched and strained, his mind racing, trying to catch up. Dr. Everett's voice crackled over the phone. "Calvin, I'm on my way. See, keep her calm. Stay with her." But Calvin was already beyond words. He had no time to wait. His hands moved instinctively, pulling at the straps of the leather harness Luna had been wearing. "Mare, help me hold her," he commanded. Mira's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, moving to Luna's side, doing her best to steady the mare. Calvin could feel the temperature rising in the barn, the tension thick and suffocating as Luna struggled with every breath. And then, with one final, brutal push, the foal was born. The room went silent. Calvin knelt beside Luna, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the foal. It was a tiny thing, limp at first, but then a soft, wheezing breath escaped it. Calvin let out a long sigh of relief. It was alive. But the relief was short-lived. As he looked closer, the foal's legs twisted unnaturally beneath it, bent at impossible angles. The foal struggled weakly, its spine twisted in a way that made Calvin's heart break. His mind spun, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before him. What happened? Mira whispered, her voice barely audible as she knelt next to her father. Calvin could only shake his head. This wasn't just an unexpected birth. This was something much darker. Dr. Everett arrived moments later, rushing into the barn, his boots clattering against the wooden floor. He barely took a moment to assess the situation before his eyes widened in shock. He bent down, checking the foal's legs and spine, his face grim. This could be congenital, Dr. Everett muttered, his hands moving gently but firmly over the foal's body. Or it could be the result of stress or improper breeding. The words hit Calvin like a punch to the gut. Improper breeding? But how? Luna had always been kept in a controlled environment. There was no way they could have missed it. Who could have done this? Calvin's voice was low, barely a whisper. And that was when Mira, still wide-eyed, turned toward the security camera mounted in the corner of the barn. Dad, I think I saw something. She quickly reached for the monitor and played back the footage from months ago. As the video played, Calvin's blood ran cold. A figure, unmistakably Kelsey, the daughter of Calvin's late best friend, could be seen sneaking a stallion into Luna's stall late one night. Under the cover of darkness, the truth was sinking in, but Calvin didn't know how to confront it. Not yet. The barn was silent now, the only sound the soft, labored breathing of Luna as she lay on the hay-strewn floor, her sides still heaving with exhaustion. Calvin, still kneeling beside her, watched the foal with a mixture of dread and disbelief. His hand shook as he touched the little creature, its small, misshapen body barely moving. Ash. The foal was tiny, frail, and broken in ways Calvin couldn't fully understand. The first thing he noticed was the twisted spine, curling slightly to the right as if it had been forced into a shape it was never meant to take. Then, the legs. Two of them were bent unnaturally, like something out of a nightmare. They weren't straight, weren't firm. They buckled under the foal's tiny frame, making it impossible for the little one to stand on its own. A sense of hopelessness began to crawl over Calvin. He reached out and gently cupped the foal's head, feeling the soft warmth of life still clinging to it, yet realizing with a sinking heart that this was no ordinary birth. Dr. Everett, who had arrived moments ago, crouched next to Calvin, his brow furrowed as he assessed the situation. The vet's eyes scanned the foal quickly, calculating the damage in an instant. He was silent for a long moment, but Calvin could feel the weight of his thoughts. Finally, Dr. Everett spoke, his voice heavy. Calvin, this is bad. The deformities, they're severe. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. This could be congenital, but given the circumstances, there's also the possibility that Luna was subjected to improper breeding, whether intentional or not. The words echoed in Calvin's mind, but they did little to ease the crushing weight on his chest. He looked down at the foal, his heart aching. It was a miracle it had survived the birth at all. The small creature stirred, trying weakly to move its head, its eyes squinting against the light. But no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't move its legs. Do you think it'll make it? Mira's voice was tentative, filled with a mix of fear and concern. She had been standing silently in the corner of the barn, watching her father, waiting for some sign that things would get better. Calvin didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, but the truth was far more complicated. He looked up at Dr. Everett, his eyes desperate. I don't know, but we need to act fast. The vet nodded solemnly. We'll need to keep it warm, and I'll need to set up a brace for its legs, but even then, there are no guarantees. I've seen worse cases, but his voice trailed off, his tone leaving the words unspoken. The foal's deformities were beyond anything he had expected. Calvin's hands clenched into fists. We have to try. We can't just let it go. Mira moved closer to the foal, her face etched with concern. She reached out and gently stroked Ash's small, trembling body. The foal responded by letting out a soft, pained whimper, and Mira's eyes welled with tears. "It's so small, Dad. It shouldn't be like this." Calvin's heart ached at the sight of his daughter's sorrow. He hated seeing her like this, but he knew there was no turning back now. The foal needed them, and as much as it broke his heart, so did Luna. She stood by, her head lowered, her large brown eyes filled with a maternal love that made Calvin's chest tighten. She nuzzled the foal gently, her warm breath ruffling his coat, as if to reassure him that she would never leave him. Luna's going to help him," Calvin said softly, though his own doubts lingered. He wasn't sure if the mare could make up for the damage that had already been done. Dr. Everett set to work quickly, pulling out a brace that he could use to support Ash's fragile legs. As he worked, Calvin watched the foal struggle with each passing minute. It tried to lift its head, but its legs seemed too weak to support its tiny body. There was nothing graceful about the movement, only the raw determination of a creature trying to survive. The hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Dr. Everett had fashioned a brace for Ash's legs, and Calvin built a small, padded corral where the foal could rest, though it seemed impossible for the creature to settle comfortably. It was too weak, too fragile, and the weight of its deformities seemed to hover over them like an ominous cloud. Throughout the process, Luna never strayed far. She stood by her foal, her breath heavy with worry, occasionally nudging him with her nose, as if to encourage him. Her loyalty and love for the small creature were undeniable, and Calvin couldn't help but admire her for it. Despite everything, she stood there, unflinching, in the face of such an overwhelming challenge. "Look at her," Mira said quietly, tears still glistening in her eyes. "She loves him so much, doesn't she?" Calvin glanced at the mare, a deep sense of respect flooding him. "She does, and so do we." By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, Ash had managed to lift his head on his own, a small victory. But his legs remained lifeless, and the twisted curve of his spine seemed to mock the efforts of everyone around him. The uncertainty in Calvin's heart grew with every passing hour. Would the foal be able to walk? Would it survive? And more importantly, what would this mean for the farm, for Luna, for his family? The dark weight of betrayal was still looming over him, too. Kelsey's actions, whatever her reasons, had already caused irreparable damage. Calvin wasn't sure how he was going to face her, let alone forgive her for what she had done to Luna, to Ash, and to the family they had once trusted. But for now, all he could focus on was getting through this night. Ash needed him. Luna needed him. And somehow, despite all the uncertainty, Calvin found a small, quiet strength in knowing that he couldn't give up on them. As he watched the foal's eyes flutter shut, a faint, fragile sense of peace settled over him. But it was clear. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. The worst was yet to come. The barn was quiet now, save for the soft snorts and the occasional rustling of hay. Luna stood vigil over her foal, Ash, who was lying on a bed of straw, still too weak to stand. Despite his struggles, the little colt was showing signs of life. And that small flicker of hope was enough to push aside the growing dread in Calvin's chest. But the weight of what had happened, of how it had happened, hung heavily in the air. Mira sat in the corner of the Warrior barn, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, eyes fixed on the foal. She'd been silent since the birth, her thoughts churning with questions that Calvin wasn't sure he could answer. The truth was, he didn't know how to explain what had happened to Ash, or why Luna had been put through such an ordeal. And more than anything, he didn't know how to explain it to himself. How could we not have seen it? Mira's voice broke the silence, raw with emotion. Calvin looked at his daughter, her tear-streaked face a mirror of his own frustration. He didn't have an answer for her, or for himself. How had they missed it? How had they been so blind to what was happening behind their backs? He couldn't stop thinking about that moment when he'd first seen Ash. the twisted legs, the crooked spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had betrayed them. "I don't know, Mira," he said softly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, "but we'll figure it out." Mira nodded, though her expression was far from reassured. She wiped her eyes, but more tears followed, her frustration seeping through every gesture. "We need to know who did this," she said firmly. "We need to know why." Her words rang out like a challenge, a call to action that Calvin couldn't ignore. But where would he even begin? Who could have done this? Kelsey was the first person who came to mind, but the thoughts seemed so surreal. How could someone so close to the family, someone who had been like a daughter to him, be capable of such a thing? Calvin's gaze shifted to the barn security camera. It had always been there, mounted in the corner of the barn to keep an eye on the livestock. It was a precaution they had put in place after a few minor thefts from the farm years ago. But now, it felt like more than just a tool. It felt like the key to understanding what had happened to Luna and Ash. He walked over to the monitor and pressed a button, replaying the footage from several months ago. Mira followed him, standing just behind her father as the video came to life on the screen. The grainy image of the barn appeared, bathed in the soft glow of the security lights. It was a quiet night, the shadows long and dark, with the faintest hint of movement toward the stall. As they watched, Mira gasped. There, in the corner of the frame, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was unmistakable. Kelsey, walking toward Luna's stall with a stallion by her side. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough. Kelsey moved swiftly, her face partially obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking her. She brought him in?" Mira whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Calvin couldn't respond. His mouth had gone dry as he watched the rest of the footage unfold. Kelsey opened the gate to Luna's stall and led the stallion inside, glancing around nervously as she did. There was no mistaking her actions. She was sneaking the stallion in to breed Luna. Something Calvin and his family had never agreed to, never intended. The video continued to play, showing the two animals in the dim light of the barn. Kelsey stayed for a few minutes, long enough for the deed to be done, before slipping back out of the stalls and disappearing into the darkness. The footage ended, and the barn returned to its usual quiet. A chilling silence followed as the screen flickered to black. Calvin stared at it, his mind numb with shock. He couldn't look away, but it felt as if everything inside him had frozen. How long had Kelsey been planning this? Had it been a moment of desperation? Or was there something more sinister at play? Mira broke the silence first. "We have to confront her, Dad. She needs to answer for this." Calvin stood motionless, still staring at the blank screen. His chest ached, as though a heavy weight was pressing down on him. He had trusted Kelsey, trusted her with the care of his farm, his animals, and his family. To see her betrayal laid bare before him was something he wasn't sure he could process. "I don't know if I can do that," Calvin murmured, his voice tight. "I don't know how to look her in the eye after this." Mira took a step toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You have to, Dad. For Luna. For Ash. We can't let her get away with this." Her words were firm, and Calvin could see the resolve in her eyes. She was right. No matter how painful it was, they couldn't let this go unaddressed. Kelsey had crossed a line, and they needed answers. Calvin nodded slowly, the decision weighing on him like a heavy stone. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. "We'll talk to her tomorrow." Mira's face softened, her hand still resting on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "This is a lot. But we'll get through it. Together." Calvin turned to face her, a weak smile tugging at his lips. "We always do, Mira. We always do." The next morning came too quickly. The mist from the night before had cleared, leaving the farm bathed in the harsh light of the early morning sun. But there was no warmth in the day for Calvin. His thoughts were still consumed with the footage, the betrayal, and the long conversation that awaited him with Kelsey. As he walked toward the house to find her, Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that the farm and his family would never be the same again. The morning sun hung heavy over the farm, casting long shadows over the barn. Calvin felt the weight of the day pressing down on him, the air thick with tension. Mare had insisted on coming with him to confront Kelsey, but Calvin could see the uncertainty in her eyes, a reflection of his own turmoil. How did you confront someone you once trusted, someone who had been like family, when they had done something so unforgivable? Kelsey's car was parked near the farmhouse, just as it had always been, a familiar sight that once filled Calvin with comfort. Now it felt like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Calvin's steps were slow as he approached, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say. Mare was by his side, her expression unreadable, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She didn't speak, but he could sense her support, her determination to get to the heart of the matter. They had to understand why Kelsey had done what she did. The door to the farmhouse creaked open as Calvin reached for the handle, the familiar scent of coffee filling the air. Kelsey was standing near the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee in her hands, her posture stiff. When she saw them, her eyes widened, and her face quickly shifted to one of caution. "Calvin," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Mare, what's going on?" Mare crossed her arms, her gaze sharp as she studied Kelsey. "You know what's going on, Kelsey?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with an intensity that cut through the air. "We saw the footage." Kelsey's face went pale, her hand tightening around the coffee cup. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence between them grew heavy, like the calm before a storm. Finally, Kelsey set the cup down on the counter with a soft clink, her shoulders slumping into feet. I guess there's no point in denying it," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of guilt and something else, something Calvin couldn't quite place. Calvin took a deep breath, his mind still struggling to comprehend the gravity of the situation. "Why, Kelsey?" he asked, his voice rough with the weight of the question. "Why did you do it? You know how much Luna means to us. To this family?" Kelsey looked away, her gaze dropping to the floor as she let out a shaky breath. She was still standing, but there was something fragile about her now, something that felt completely different from the confident woman who had walked into their lives years ago. Calvin's heart twisted as he saw the pain in her face, but it didn't erase the betrayal he was feeling. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what else to do." Calvin stepped closer, the confusion in his chest growing deeper. "What are you talking about?" His voice was sharper now, frustration mixing with the pain he had been holding inside. "You didn't know what else to do. You put Luna in harm's way, Kelsey. You did this to her, and to the foal." "I was desperate," she said, her voice cracking as she finally met Calvin's gaze. "You don't understand. I lost everything, Calvin. Everything." Her eyes welled up with tears, and she wiped them quickly. But the damage was done. The vulnerability in her voice was impossible to ignore. Calvin felt his chest tighten. He wanted to be angry, wanted to shout, but something in Kelsey's voice stopped him. She had been hiding something all along, something deeper than just the foal. He couldn't deny it now. There was more to this than he had thought. "What do you mean, Kelsey?" Mare asked, her voice softer now, but still filled with that harsh, sharp edge of confusion. "Why didn't you just come to us? We're family." Kelsey took a deep breath, then shook her head as if the words she was about to say were the hardest she had ever spoken. "My dad, before he died, he left me with a debt, a huge debt, and when I lost my job, I didn't know how I was going to keep up with everything. I couldn't afford my bills, couldn't afford anything. I was falling apart. and no one knew. I felt like I was drowning. She paused, her face pale, her voice full of regret. I thought if Luna had a foal, I could sell it, get enough money to pay off the debt, get back on my feet. I didn't think it would turn out like this. The silence that followed Kelsey's confession was thick and uncomfortable. Calvin was stunned. Kelsey had always seemed so confident, so capable. To hear her say she was struggling with something so deeply personal, something so invisible to everyone else, was like hearing a stranger speak. "But you didn't think it through, Kelsey," Mare said, her voice filled with disbelief. "You never stopped to think about what this would mean for Luna, for the foal? You didn't even think about us?" Kelsey's shoulders trembled slightly as she wiped away another tear. I know, and I'm sorry. I should have come to you. I should have asked for help, but I didn't. I thought I could fix everything on my own. I was ashamed." Calvin's heart softened just a little, but the anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He couldn't just forgive her, not yet. The damage had been done, and it wasn't just about money. It was about trust, and trust couldn't be rebuilt so easily. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this," Calvin said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. "You violated our trust. Kelsey, you betrayed this family, and I'm not sure how to move past that." Kelsey's face fell at his words, and she nodded slowly, as though she had been expecting that response. "I understand," she said softly, her voice filled with a deep sadness. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just wanted you to know the truth. I never meant for it to go this far." Mare stepped forward, her expression still conflicted but softer now. "We need to take care of Ash, Kelsey," she said firmly. "That's all that matters right now. We can't undo what's been done, but we can help him." Kelsey nodded quickly, her expression earnest. "I'll help. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Calvin watched the exchange between his daughter and Kelsey, a sense of sorrow weighing heavily on his heart. He wasn't sure what the future held for any of them, but one thing was clear. Things had changed, and whether they could rebuild their broken trust was still uncertain. Underscore, 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 underscore. The days following Kelsey's confession passed in a blur of uncertainty and quiet tension. The air was thick with unspoken words, and the barn, once a place of joy and peace, felt heavy and oppressive. The unease that had settled over the farm was palpable, lingering in the corners of every room, every empty field. Ash was still too fragile, too broken to stand on his own, and despite the brace Dr. Everett had fashioned for his legs, the little foal's future remained uncertain. But as the days wore on, one thing became clear. The battle wasn't just against Ash's deformities. It was also against the whispers and rumors that were slowly spreading through the town. The small, tight-knit community of Virginia had always prided itself on being close. Neighbors helped neighbors, people shared what they had, and the sense of unity was something that held the town together. But now, that unity was beginning to unravel, one word at a time. People had started talking. And with talk came judgment. It started small, as these things often do. At first, it was just a few whispers behind closed doors, a few conversations that stopped when Calvin or Mare walked by. But slowly, the whispers grew louder. The tension was now palpable whenever Calvin went into town. At the local feed store, the clerk's smile was tight, her eyes avoiding his. At the market, the butcher gave him a curt nod but said nothing more. No one knew what to say to him, or if they even wanted to. As Calvin walked into the small, local diner one afternoon, he felt the eyes of the entire room on him. The usual chatter had stopped. Even the clinking of silverware against plates seemed to fade into the background. The silence was suffocating, and Calvin could feel it settle over him like a weight. He made his way to the counter, where Sally, the diner's owner, stood polishing a glass. Her eyes flickered nervously when she saw him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Morning, Calvin," Sally said, her voice too bright, as though she were trying to break the ice, but failing miserably. "Morning, Sally," Calvin replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing discomfort. He sat down at the counter, staring at the menu in front of him, though he had no intention of ordering. The town's quiet judgment was more than he could take. It was as if the entire weight of Kelsey's actions had been placed squarely on his shoulders. He could feel the townspeople's eyes on him, their silent accusations echoing in every corner. Sally cleared her throat, clearly struggling with the tension. "I just want you to know, Calvin, we're all thinking of you. It's just, well, people are talking." Calvin looked up at her, his brow furrowing. "What are they saying?" His voice was low, laced with the exhaustion of days spent battling not only the physical challenges Ash faced, but the emotional toll that the town's gossip was taking. Sally hesitated before answering. "There's a lot of talk about how you didn't know, about how you let it happen. People are saying you should have seen the signs. Some are blaming you for the Foal's deformities. Others say you should have kept a better eye on things." The words hit Calvin like a punch to the stomach. The blame, the anger, the judgment, it was all aimed at him. It didn't matter that he had no idea what Kelsey had done. It didn't matter that he had trusted her. All that mattered was the Foal, the deformities that were visible for everyone to see. The whispers had turned into accusations. "You know it's not my fault," Calvin muttered, his fingers tightening into fists on the counter. "I didn't do this. Kelsey?" His voice trailed off, and he sighed heavily. It didn't matter what he said, what explanation he gave. They had already made up their minds. Sally's face softened with sympathy. "I know, Calvin, but there's not much you can do about what people are saying. It's just the way things are around here." The truth of her words stung. Calvin knew that small towns like theirs thrived on gossip. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and when something like this happened, it became a spectacle. The sympathy, the judgments, it all felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him. As Calvin left the diner, the reality of his situation hit him harder than ever. He wasn't just fighting for Ash's survival or Luna's well-being. He was fighting for his own reputation, his own dignity in a town that was slowly turning its back on him. The whispers of betrayal, the quiet condemnation, it was all becoming too much. It was as if Kelsey's mistake had become his, and there was no escaping it. The next few days were no better. The gossip spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the town. A local reporter named Lucy had even approached Calvin with an offer to tell their story. "It's a powerful narrative," she said, her tone slick and professional. "People will want to hear it. You'll be able to share your side, your pain. It'll help you clear your name." But Calvin wasn't interested. "Ash is not a headline," he replied firmly, his voice unwavering. He would not allow his family's pain to be used as entertainment for the town. He wouldn't let them turn his struggles into a spectacle. And yet, the pressure continued to mount. Some of the townspeople rallied behind him, offering quiet words of support, but others continued to point fingers, to judge him for things he had no control over. Calvin felt the weight of their eyes on him everywhere he went. The town was divided, and no matter how hard he tried to maintain his composure, the cracks in his confidence were beginning to show. Mare noticed the change in him. She saw the way he withdrew, the way he started spending more and more time in the barn with Luna and Ash, avoiding the town and its whispers. She could see the toll it was taking on her father, the man who had always been the rock of their family. One evening, as the sun began to set, Mare found Calvin standing alone by the fence, watching the pasture in silence. Ash had finally managed to take a few shaky steps, his small legs wobbling beneath him. Luna stood close by, her watchful eyes never leaving her foal. The sight filled Calvin's heart with a quiet sense of pride. But the sting of the town's divided opinions remained. "They're not right, Dad," Mare said, stepping beside him. "They can't know everything. I know, Calvin replied softly, his eyes never leaving the foal. But it doesn't change what they're saying. It doesn't change how they look at us. Mira stood by his side, her shoulders squared, her voice steady. They don't get to decide who we are. They don't get to decide what matters. Calvin looked down at her, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. His daughter was strong, stronger than he had been, stronger than he ever thought possible. And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could weather this storm together. Underscore, 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 underscore. The weeks that followed Kelsey's confession were a blur of uncertainty. Ash's condition remained precarious, and though the small foal continued to fight, it was clear that each day was a battle. The deformities in his legs had not improved, and though he tried to stand, his legs would tremble beneath him, unable to support his weight for more than a few seconds. The pressure in Calvin's chest grew with each failed attempt. He knew that Ash's survival was hanging by a thread, but every time the foal struggled, Luna would nuzzle him gently, as if to reassure him that it was okay to fall. It wasn't just Ash's body that was fragile. Calvin could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, suffocating him with each passing day. It was one thing to watch Ash fight for his life, but it was something else, entirely to watch the quiet strength of Luna as she stood guard over her foal. Calvin spent hours in the barn, sometimes pacing, sometimes sitting on the worn wooden benches, as he watched Ash attempt to rise again, only to collapse. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but he didn't allow himself a break. Every time Ash fell, Calvin was there lifting him up, comforting him, as if his own strength could somehow transfer to the foal. Mira, too, had become a regular presence in the barn. She often sat by Ash's side, talking softly to him, as though her words could give him the strength he so desperately needed. She spent hours working with her father to help design a more comfortable or stable corral for Ash, one that would allow him to practice standing without risking further injury. It was the small, quiet things like this that gave them hope. They were doing everything they could to give Ash a fighting chance, even if it wasn't enough. But despite their best efforts, there were still moments when the harsh reality would settle over them like a dark cloud. One of those moments came late one evening when Calvin found himself standing outside the barn watching the sunset as the cool night air settled in. The day had been hard. Ash had made little progress, and the constant cycle of hope and failure was beginning to take its toll. Mira approached him, her boots crunching on the gravel path. She had a tired but determined look in her eyes, a look that reminded Calvin so much of his late wife. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but steady, I think he's ready." Calvin turned to her, confusion written across his face. "Ready? Ready for what?" "For the next step," Mira said, "for standing on his own." Calvin's heart skipped a beat. The thought that Ash might be ready to stand on his own seemed too far out of reach. But Mira's voice was full of conviction, and he could see the spark of hope in her eyes. "We've been doing everything we can," she continued. "We've been patient. We've supported him. Now, it's time for him to try. And this time, it'll be different." Calvin didn't know what to say. There were no guarantees, no promises that Ash would be able to stand, let alone walk. But there was something in Mira's voice, something in the way she believed in Ash, that made Calvin's heart swell with pride. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." The next morning, the barn felt different. The usual quiet was replaced with a sense of anticipation, as if everyone knew that today was a turning point. Calvin and Mira spent the early hours preparing the corral, reinforcing the edges and smoothing out the ground to make it as safe as possible for Ash. Luna, as always, stood watch over her foal, her large brown eyes following his every move. The bond between them was undeniable. Calvin watched as Mira gently coaxed Ash to his feet, guiding him slowly to the center of the corral. Ash's legs shook beneath him, his body wobbly and unsteady. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, unsure of whether he could take that first step. But Luna was there, standing just a few feet away, offering silent encouragement. With a quiet breath, Ash took a tentative step forward, his legs trembling beneath him. For a moment, it seemed like he might collapse, but then something shifted. Ash steadied himself. His legs still buckled, but he was standing on his own. Mira let out a breath of relief, a soft, almost inaudible laugh escaping her lips. Calvin couldn't help but smile, a mixture of pride and awe filling his heart. The foal was standing. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. "Look at him, Dad," Mira whispered, her eyes shining. He's doing it." Calvin stood frozen for a moment, his heart swelling in his chest as he watched the foal. The small victory felt monumental. It was a step forward, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the struggle. Ash might not be able to run yet, might not even be able to walk properly, but he had taken his first steps toward independence. And for that, Calvin was grateful. "Yeah," Calvin said, his voice thick with emotion. "He is." As the days passed, Ash continued to make slow but steady progress. His legs still wobbled, and his movements remained jerky, but there was a determination in his eyes, a will to live that was undeniable. Every small victory, every time he stood on his own, every step he took, was a testament to the strength of his spirit and to the unwavering love of Luna. But there was more to it than just Ash's progress. Calvin couldn't deny that his own heart was healing in small ways as well. Watching Ash take those first steps, seeing the foal fight for his life, reminded him of the resilience of the human spirit. It was a reminder that even when things seemed impossible, even when the odds were stacked against them, there was always hope. One evening, as the sun began to set and the barn was bathed in the warm glow of twilight, Calvin stood outside, leaning on the fence. Luna was grazing nearby, her head low as she took slow, deliberate bites of the grass. Ash, now more stable on his legs, was walking alongside her, his movements still awkward but growing steadier with each passing day. Mira joined him, her eyes fixed on the two of them. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Calvin nodded, his eyes following Ash as the foal took another unsteady step. "Yeah, we have." "There's still a long road ahead," Mira said, her voice thoughtful. "But we've got each other." "We've always had each other," Calvin replied, his voice filled with quiet pride. And in that moment, standing together by the fence, watching the foal take his first steps toward the future, Calvin finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this together. Underscore, 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 underscore. The crisp autumn's air carried the scent of hay and earth as the days grew shorter, and the gentle rhythm of life on the farm began to settle into something resembling routine. Despite Ash's steady progress, a quiet tension still hung in the air. Calvin and Mira had focused all their energy on the foal, on Luna, and on healing the physical wounds that had been inflicted. But the emotional scars, the betrayal, remained. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Kelsey's confession, but Calvin had yet to speak with her again. The visit to the farmhouse, the confession, the exchange of apologies, it had all happened too fast, too abruptly. Since then, Kelsey had stayed away, respecting Calvin's silence, but there had been no closure, no resolution. And now, with Ash starting to stand on his own, Calvin knew it was time. He couldn't move forward without addressing the wound Kelsey had left behind. It was early morning when Kelsey arrived at the farm. The sky was still painted with the soft pink hues of dawn, and the dew on the grass glistened as though the world was holding its breath. Calvin was in the barn, cleaning out the stalls, his back to the doors, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. "Calvin." Kelsey's voice was tentative, carrying a quiet sadness that was almost palpable. Can we talk?" Calvin didn't turn around immediately. His heart was still heavy with everything that had happened. The betrayal, the secrecy, the pain. But in the end, he knew that avoiding it wouldn't fix anything. He needed to confront it, needed to make his peace, one way or another. He set the pitchfork down and turned slowly to face her, his expression unreadable. Kelsey stood a few feet away, her hands nervously clasped together, her eyes avoiding his. She looked different somehow, smaller, worn down by the weight of her actions. The woman who had once been a part of his life, of his family, now felt like a stranger. "Calvin," she began again, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for what I did, for everything. I never should have gone behind your back like that. I never meant to hurt Luna, or you, or anyone. I was just so desperate. I thought I could fix everything, and in the process, I only made it worse." Calvin studied her for a long moment, the silence between them growing thick. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make her feel the weight of what she'd done. But as he stood there, looking at her, he realized that the anger wasn't enough. It wasn't going to heal the wounds. It wasn't going to help Ash. And it certainly wasn't going to help them. "You didn't just make it worse for me, Kelsey," Calvin said slowly, his voice low but firm. "You made it worse for Luna. For Ash, you violated the trust we had with you." Kelsey winced at his words, her shoulders sagging. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me, not yet, but I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just didn't know where else to turn. My world was falling apart, and I thought this was the only way out. I made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. And I'm so sorry." Calvin felt a flicker of something in his chest. Regret, perhaps, or something like pity. But it was quickly extinguished by the bitterness that still lingered. He had spent so many sleepless nights replaying everything in his mind, trying to make sense of Kelsey's actions. He had trusted her, and she had shattered that trust. And as much as he wanted to believe in her remorse, he couldn't ignore the fact that the damage was done. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Calvin admitted, his voice softening just a little. "I want to believe you, Kelsey. I want to believe that you didn't mean to hurt us, but it's not just about intentions. It's about what you did." Kelsey nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand. I really do. I've been thinking about it every day, and I'll do anything to make it right, if you'll let me." Calvin took a deep breath, rubbing his hand over his face. He didn't want to forgive her just yet. The pain of it all was too raw, too fresh. But there was something in Kelsey's voice, something in her eyes that told him she was truly sorry. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was enough to acknowledge the possibility of healing. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, Kelsey," Calvin said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "Not right now, not with everything that's happened. But I'm willing to move forward. For Ash, for Luna, for the farm, and for my family." Kelsey looked up at him, her face filled with both relief and regret. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance. I won't let you down again." Calvin nodded, but there was something in his chest that told him this wasn't the end of it. He still had boundaries to set, still had to figure out what role Kelsey could play in their lives, if any. "You're not welcome near the horses, Kelsey," Calvin said, his voice steady. "Not for now. Maybe not ever. I can't let you near Luna or Ash again. Not after what you did. I can't risk it." Kelsey's face fell, but she didn't argue. "I understand. I'll respect your decision." For the first time in a long while, Calvin felt something like peace settle into his bones. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was progress. Sometimes forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Sometimes it was about drawing a line, setting boundaries, and deciding what was worth protecting. "Thank you for coming," Calvin said finally, his voice still steady but softer now. "But for now, that's all. We'll figure out the rest." Kelsey nodded and turned away, walking slowly toward her car. As she left, Calvin felt the weight of everything they had been through slowly start to lift. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but there was hope. Hope for Ash. Hope for Luna. Hope for the farm. And maybe, just maybe, hope for the fragile threads of trust that remained. The air was thick with anticipation that evening as a low rumble of thunder rolled over the farm. A storm was coming, and for the first time in weeks, Calvin felt a sense of unease that had little to do with the weather itself. His thoughts were a whirlwind of concern for Ash, Luna, and what lay ahead for them all. Despite the progress they had made, despite the small victories, the uncertainty never fully left him. There were still too many unknowns, too many moments of doubt. Ash had taken his first steps, yes. His legs were still weak, still trembled beneath him, but they were getting stronger, day by day. His body still bore the marks of his difficult birth, the twisted limbs and crooked spine that had once seemed so insurmountable. But with each new day, the foal's spirit seemed to grow stronger. And Luna, always by his side, always steady, was proving to be more than just a mother. She was a constant source of strength, an unwavering pillar of love and protection. Together, they were defying the odds, inch by inch. Yet, even as the storm clouds gathered above, Calvin couldn't escape the nagging feeling that they were on the cusp of something. Something beyond the trials of the past weeks. He watched Ash carefully, noting the small but significant progress the foal made each day. But tonight, something felt different. As the storm drew nearer, Calvin noticed Ash attempting to rise again. The foal had been trying more often recently. Pushing himself to stand, his legs quivering, his body unsteady. This time, however, there was something different in his movements. For the first time since the day of his birth, Ash wasn't just trying to rise. He was determined. His small body quivered with effort, and his eyes, though still clouded with confusion, showed a spark of determination that Calvin had not seen before. Luna stood nearby, watching over him with quiet patience. She was always there, never pushing, never hurrying him, but always steady in her silent encouragement. It was as if she knew that Ash would find his footing in his own time, and all she had to do was be present. And Calvin watched, his breath caught in his throat. The storm outside rumbled louder, the wind picking up, sending the trees swaying in the distance. But within the barn, there was a stillness, a moment of calm that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Then, it happened. Ash pushed himself to his hooves, and for a moment Calvin thought he might fall, that he might collapse again, like he had done so many times before. But this time, he didn't. Slowly, cautiously, Ash wobbled on his legs, his body trembling as he stood. And then, with a soundless exhale, the foal took one step forward, then another. Calvin's heart leapt in his chest. It was slow. It was shaky. But it was happening. Ash was walking. The foal's legs still quivered beneath him, but with each step his confidence seemed to grow, as though he could feel the earth beneath him for the first time. And Luna, always there, always guiding him, nudged him gently with her muzzle, as if to say, "You're doing it, huh, little one?" Mare, who had been standing by the door, her eyes watching quietly, couldn't contain her excitement. She gasped, then rushed toward her father. "Dad, look, he's walking. He's really walking." Calvin couldn't speak. His throat tightened as he watched the foal take another wobbly step, then another, each one more stable than the last. Ash, the foal who had been born with so many challenges, was now standing on his own, moving forward. It wasn't just the physical act of walking that moved Calvin. It was the sheer willpower, the determination that had carried Ash this far, despite all the odds. The foal had fought through every hurdle, every setback, and now he was walking slowly but surely, and Luna, standing by his side, was the perfect image of maternal strength. Her steady presence grounding the foal as he took his first steps into the world beyond the barn. "It's a miracle," Mare whispered, her eyes shining with tears. He's gonna make it, Dad. Calvin nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and awe. He hadn't allowed himself to hope fully before, not like this. But now, seeing Ash walking, seeing the foal persevere, he couldn't deny it any longer. The small victories were adding up. There was hope, after all. As the storm raged outside, the sound of the wind howling against the barn walls inside, there was a quiet sense of triumph. Ash was walking, he was moving, and for the first time in a long while, Calvin allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The storm outside grew louder, the flashes of lightning illuminating the barn in stark bursts of white light, but within the walls of the barn, it felt like the world had stilled for a moment. Calvin watched as Luna nuzzled Ash, her soft wickers of encouragement filling the space, and Ash, for the first time, stood without support. He was standing on his own. It was a turning point, a moment that would define the rest of their journey. Mare stepped closer to Calvin, her voice soft but filled with awe. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Calvin's gaze never left Ash as the foal took another tentative step, the movement slow but undeniably real. "He's already more than okay," Calvin said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's a fighter. He's going to make it." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the barn, there was calm. There was hope. There was a future. And as Ash took another step, this time without faltering, Calvin knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, still doubts, still moments of fear. But the turning point had come. Ash was walking, Luna was there, watching over him, and Calvin knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The storm might have raged outside, but in the barn, in the small world they had created for themselves, there was peace. There was love. And there was the unmistakable sense that they had made it through the worst of it. As the days grew colder and the leaves of autumn began to blanket the ground in hues of gold and red, the farm slowly found its rhythm again. The storm that had torn through the night, rattling windows and shaking the barn's frame, seemed to have left something more than just fallen branches in its wake. The world outside was quieter now, but inside the walls of the barn, life was slowly returning to normal. Ash had made remarkable progress. The foal, once so fragile and uncertain, was now standing steadily on his own. His legs still wobbled from time to time, but they no longer buckled beneath him as they once had. With Luna's constant watchful eye, Ash grew stronger every day. He started moving across the barn with increasing confidence, each step a triumph. And though there were still challenges ahead, the promise of what he might become hung in the air like a beacon of hope. For Calvin and Mare, the change in Ash wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The quiet fear that had once gripped their hearts, the fear that Ash might never walk or grow strong, had begun to melt away. In its place, a steady confidence had taken root. It wasn't just that Ash was walking, it was that they had fought for him. They had watched him struggle. But in the end, they had believed in him, in his strength to rise against all odds. But as much as Ash's recovery brought joy and relief, it also brought with it a new challenge: how to share this victory with the world. It wasn't just about the foal's survival anymore. It was about the story that had been born from his struggle, one that had touched the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. It was Mare who had first come up with the idea. Late one night, as they sat in the living room with mugs of tea, watching Ash and Luna outside the window, she had turned to her father with a glint of determination in her eyes. "We need to share his story, Dad," Mare said, her voice filled with resolve. "People need to hear about him, about how hard he fought, about how we fought for him." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mare continued, "we've been through so much already, and I think it would help. It would help to show people that no matter how broken something is, it can still heal. Ash is a symbol of that. And Luna, too. She's been incredible. I think people could really relate to their story. It could help others, Dad." Calvin was silent for a moment, his fingers absently tracing the edge of his mug. The thought of putting their story out there, of inviting the world into their most personal moments, was daunting. But at the same time, Mira's words felt right. Maybe it was time to share what they had been through. Maybe it was time to show the world that even in the most difficult circumstances, there was hope, there was perseverance, there was... The next morning, Calvin and Mira decided to take the first step. They began setting up a website, a place where they could document Ash's journey and share it with others. They posted pictures, updates, and small videos of Ash's progress, his first steps, his wobbly walk, his bright eyes full of life. But what began as a simple way to track Ash's recovery soon began to take on a life voice of its own. As more people saw the videos, the photos, the updates, something incredible began to happen. Messages started to pour in. People from all over the country, even from other parts of the world, began commenting, sending emails, and sharing their own stories. Within days, the website had gained thousands of visitors. Comments ranged from expressions of awe to stories of personal triumph, of people who had overcome their own struggles in ways that mirrored Ash's journey. Calvin had no idea how quickly their story would spread. They weren't trying to make a name for themselves. They were simply sharing their experience. But somehow, their story resonated with people. Ash became more than just a foal on a farm. He became a symbol of resilience, of the strength to rise when everything seemed impossible. The story of his birth, his struggles, and his eventual triumph captivated people, reminding them that even in the darkest moments, there was always hope. As the weeks passed, the attention grew. One afternoon, a reporter from a local news station arrived at the farm to interview Calvin and Mira. She had heard about the website and wanted to share Ash's story on the evening news. Calvin hesitated. He had turned down the reporter earlier in the year, when the gossip and rumors had spread, not wanting to turn their private pain into public spectacle. But now, it felt different. The story wasn't about pity. It was about triumph. It was about how a family, a mother, and a foal had fought together against the odds and won. When the camera crew arrived, Calvin found himself standing at the fence, Ash grazing nearby, Luna close behind. The wind had picked up, and the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the pasture. The reporter approached, microphone in hand, and began to ask questions. Calvin answered them as best he could, his voice steady but emotional as he spoke about Ash's recovery, about Luna's incredible bond with her foal, and about the power of hope in the face of adversity. Mira stood beside him, watching the interview from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. This wasn't about making headlines anymore. It was about giving people something real, something they could hold on to in times of struggle. It was about sharing a story of perseverance that, in many ways, reflected the journey they had all been on together. By the time the interview was over, the sun was setting, painting the sky with colors of orange and pink. Ash and Luna had moved to the far corner of the pasture, grazing peacefully. The world felt at peace for a moment, as though everything had come full circle. That night, as Calvin and Mira sat down to dinner, they received a flood of messages from people who had seen the interview, people who were inspired by Ash's story. One message in particular stood out. It was from a mother whose daughter had been born with physical challenges, who had watched Ash take his first steps and been reminded that her child, too, could overcome obstacles. Another message was from a man who had lost his job and was struggling to find hope, but who had watched the video of Ash and found the strength to keep going. As Mira read the messages aloud, Calvin felt a lump in his throat. "I didn't think it would be like this," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't either," Mira replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But I'm glad we did it, Dad. I'm glad we shared him with the world." Calvin smiled, his heart swelling with pride for his daughter and for the family they had built together. Ash, despite all the odds, had become something much bigger than a foal on a farm. He had become a beacon of hope for others, a symbol that no matter how broken something seemed, it could still be healed, still be loved. And for the first time in a long time, Calvin believed that their story, Ash's story, was exactly what the world needed. The first rays of spring broke through the late winter clouds, casting a soft golden glow across the pasture. The farm, once cloaked in the quiet desolation of winter, now seemed alive with promise. Calvin stood at the fence, his hand resting on the worn wood as he watched the landscape transform. The fields, once barren, were now starting to show the first signs of renewal. The trees had begun to bud, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and grass. It had been months since Ash had taken his first steps, since that fateful day when the foal had risen, wobbly and uncertain, on legs that had seemed too weak to carry him. But now, as the seasons shifted, so too had the rhythm of life on the farm. Ash was no longer the fragile, unsteady creature that had once fought for survival. He was a young foal, strong and vibrant, his legs steady beneath him, his body filled with energy. He moved across the pasture with increasing confidence, running and playing with Luna, who had never left his side. Her protective gaze never wavered, always watching, always ensuring that her foal was safe, that he was growing. Calvin smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride. The bond between Luna and Ash was something rare, something sacred. It was a love born of struggle, of hardship, and of the quiet, unwavering faith that no matter the obstacles, they would be together. And now, as Ash grew stronger with each passing day, it was clear that the bond between them had become something even more profound. Mare stood beside her father, her eyes fixed on the two horses in the field. She had watched Ash grow from the foal that could barely stand to the spirited young colt running free across the pasture. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The farm, too, had changed. It was no longer just a place of struggle and survival. It had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the quiet strength that ran through each of them. They're amazing," Mare said softly, her voice full of awe as she watched Luna nuzzle Ash, the mother's gentle affection evident in every movement. Calvin nodded, his gaze never leaving the two of them. "They are." Mare turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how far we've come, Dad?" "I do," Calvin replied quietly. "I think about it every day." The road to this point had been long and full of uncertainty and pain, but it had been worth every moment. Calvin had learned, through his struggles, that sometimes it wasn't about having all the answers, or even knowing the outcome. It was about taking each day as it came, about doing the best they could and trusting that eventually the pieces would fall into place. Luna had always been their strength, and Ash, their hope. The farm had become a place not just of survival, but of growth, of healing, and of a new purpose. And that purpose, that hope, had rippled out into the world. Since the news had spread, the website, the interviews, and the messages had poured in from people across the country and even around the world. Ash's story had touched something deep in people's hearts. They saw themselves in the foal, their own struggles, their own triumphs, and they found inspiration in his fight for life. It wasn't just about a foal born with deformities. It was about the strength to rise when everything seemed lost. It was about perseverance, and it was about love. Now, as Calvin looked out over the field, watching Ash run clumsily but joyfully toward his mother, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Mare had already turned toward the barn, her footsteps light and purposeful. Calvin followed her gaze, watching as she walked to the far side of the pasture where the fence needed a repair. She had taken on more responsibility at the farm in the months since Ash's recovery. It had become her mission, too, to ensure that the farm would remain a place of peace and healing. "You know," Mare said, glancing back at her father as she walked, "I've been thinking about all the people who've reached out. They've all been so moved by Ash's story, Dad. It's like they needed him too." Calvin's heart skipped a beat. I know. I didn't expect it to reach so many people. I don't think any of us did, Mira said, her tone contemplative. But it's more than just Ash's recovery. It's what he represents. People see him, and they see themselves. Fighting through things, fighting for something bigger than themselves. For a long moment, Calvin said nothing. He hadn't quite realized the impact their journey had on others, but hearing Mira say it aloud made it clear. Ash had become more than just a foal to them. He had become a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest times, when the world seemed full of obstacles, there was always a way forward. And the love and dedication of a mother, of family, could carry them through. I think we've given them something important, Mira added, her voice filled with certainty. Something they can hold on to. McCalvin smiled, his eyes glistening with quiet emotion. Yeah, I think we have. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the pasture, Calvin stood there, his heart full. He had fought for Ash, just as Ash had fought for his life. But now, it was more than that. It was a story of love, of family, of second chances, and of hope. It was a story that had inspired so many, a story that would continue to inspire, long after the farm had faded into the background. Ash's laughter, if a foal could laugh, rang out across the field as he and Luna ran together, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. Calvin knew, deep in his soul, that this was just the beginning. This was where it all started. The pain, the healing, the growth. And it had brought them to this moment, this place of quiet joy. They had come through the darkness. They had emerged stronger, together. And as the sun set, painting the sky with colors of pink and purple, Calvin leaned against the fence, watching his son, his foal, take one more joyous leap across the pasture. And he didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to do anything. Because in this moment, everything was as it should be. They tried to hide how he came into the world, but love didn't care about the how, only the who, and the who was enough.